Marcus Chen stared at the alien interface floating before him, its crystalline surface pulsing with colors that had no names in any human language. The Zephyrian tournament official, a being that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a storm cloud, gestured toward the neural connection pod with what might have been impatience. Human participant, the official's voice buzzed through the universal translator, you have 60 seconds to connect or forfeit your species' entry into the Galactic Virtual Combat Championships. Marcus had trained for this moment for 3 years. When humanity first made contact with the galactic community, they discovered that most conflicts between species were resolved through virtual combat rather than actual warfare. The technology was so advanced that participants could die in the simulation and be perfectly fine afterward, but the mental and tactical skills required were very real. The problem was that humans had never won a single match. Every other species in the galaxy had evolved alongside this technology for thousands of years. Their minds were adapted to the quantum neural interfaces that powered the virtual battlefields. Humans, with their crude biological neural networks, were considered a joke. Most aliens placed bets on how quickly human participants would be eliminated. Marcus lowered himself into the pod, feeling the cool metal against his skin. The neural crown descended, and thousands of microfilaments made contact with his scalp. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, reality dissolved. He found himself standing on a vast metallic platform suspended in space. Around him, the other 99 participants materialized. Each represented a different species, and the diversity was staggering. Crystalline beings that looked like living diamonds stood next to flowing energy creatures that had no fixed form. Gas-based life forms wearing containment suits floated beside armored warriors from high-gravity worlds. The tournament rules were simple but brutal. 100 participants entered, but only one could leave victorious. Death in the simulation meant immediate elimination, and participants had access to any weapon or technology their minds could conceive and control through the neural interface. Most aliens immediately began manifesting elaborate weapons and defensive systems. The Korthax representative, a reptilian species known for their technological mastery, created a floating fortress bristling with energy cannons. The ethereal delegate, being made of pure thought, simply became a swirling vortex of destructive psychic energy. Marcus stood still, watching and learning. The first wave of eliminations began within seconds. Lesser species were obliterated by more advanced civilizations before they could even react. Beams of coherent energy, matter disruption fields, and weapons that folded space itself turned a third of the participants into glowing particles that faded from existence. But Marcus had noticed something the others hadn't. While they were all focused on creating increasingly elaborate weapons, they were burning through their neural energy at an unsustainable rate. The interface required mental focus to maintain any creation, and the more complex the weapon or defense, the more exhausting it became. A Vorthack warrior, encased in what appeared to be a mechanical suit the size of a small building, turned its attention to Marcus. The human looked pathetically underprepared compared to the walking tank bearing down on him. Primitive human, the Vorthack's voice boomed across the battlefield, I will make your death quick. The alien's suit bristled with weapons that began charging with deadly light. Marcus did something that surprised everyone watching. He smiled and began to run. Not away from the Vorthack, but directly toward it. The crowd of spectators in the physical arena, representing hundreds of species across the galaxy, murmured in confusion. On the massive holographic display showing the battle, it looked like the human was committing suicide. As energy beams lanced toward him, Marcus did something no other species had thought to try. Instead of creating elaborate shields or weapons, he simply changed the rules. The neural interface responded to thought and will, but every other species approached it like a tool to be used. Humans, Marcus realized, were different. They didn't just use tools, they became them. His consciousness didn't try to control the simulation, it merged with it. The energy beams that should have vaporized him instead passed harmlessly through his position. Not because he had created a shield, but because he had convinced the simulation that he wasn't entirely there anymore. He existed in a quantum state between real and virtual, present and absent. The Vorthack's weapons systems began malfunctioning as Marcus approached. Not because of any attack, but because the human's very presence was causing logical paradoxes in the simulation. How do you target something that exists and doesn't exist simultaneously? Marcus reached out and touched the massive mechanical suit. The moment his hand made contact, the entire construct began to unravel. The Vorthak warrior inside screamed as his carefully crafted battle system dissolved into base code, leaving him defenseless on the platform. Impossible, the Vorthak whispered before Marcus ended the simulation with a thought, eliminating the alien from the tournament. The remaining participants stopped their battles and turned to stare at the human. In the space of 30 seconds, he had done something that violated every known principle of virtual combat. The spectators in the arena fell silent, confusion and fear rippling through the crowd. Commander Zix of the Hegemony Fleet, watching from the VIP section, leaned forward in his seat. As the reigning champion of the last 5 tournaments, he had never seen anything like this. His species, the Nexari, had dominated virtual combat for centuries through their ability to process massive amounts of information simultaneously. What did the human just do? He asked his aide. The aide, a nervous Clixon with 6 eyes, was rapidly scrolling through data on a holographic display. Sir, according to our sensors, the human somehow convinced the simulation that the Vorthak's weapons didn't exist while maintaining the existence of the warrior himself. It's theoretically impossible. On the battlefield, Marcus was already moving toward his next target. A group of 5 Christarch warriors had formed a defensive formation, their diamond-hard bodies refracting light into deadly laser arrays. They had seen what happened to the Vorthak and were preparing for something unprecedented. But Marcus didn't approach them directly. Instead, he sat down cross-legged on the platform and closed his eyes. The Christarch leader, Prism 7, felt uncertainty for the first time in the simulation. What is the human doing? Why has it stopped moving? Around the battlefield, other participants were equally confused. Some began moving closer, thinking the human had given up or malfunctioned. Others stayed back, suspecting a trap. Marcus wasn't giving up. He was learning. Every virtual reality system had underlying code, base programming that determined how the simulation functioned. Most species worked within those parameters, using the interface to manipulate objects and energy within the established rules. But humans had something unique, pattern recognition combined with intuitive leaps of logic. While sitting motionless, Marcus was feeling his way through the fundamental structure of the simulation itself. His consciousness was mapping the quantum pathways that determined reality within the virtual space. And what he found was fascinating. The system had been designed by the architects, an ancient species that had vanished millions of years ago. Their approach to reality was mathematical, based on predictable patterns and logical progressions. But they had built in one crucial element that no current species understood: adaptive evolution. The simulation was designed to change and grow based on the participants' actions. Most species, with their rigid technological thinking, used it the same way generation after generation. The system had become stagnant, predictable. But humans approached problems differently. They didn't just use tools, they imagined new ways tools could work. They didn't just follow patterns, they broke them and created new ones. Marcus opened his eyes and stood up. Around him, the very nature of the virtual battlefield began to shift. The Christarch warriors watched in horror as their carefully constructed laser arrays began to bend and twist. Not under any external force, but because the simulation itself was rewriting the laws of physics in their immediate area. Impossible! Prism 7 shouted, but his voice was distorting as sound waves began following new rules that Marcus was unconsciously writing into the system. Marcus walked toward the group, and, with each step, reality became more fluid around him. The other participants could feel it too, a fundamental change in the nature of their virtual environment. Some tried to flee to other areas of the battlefield, but the changes were spreading. A Zephyrian warrior, one of the species known for their mastery of energy manipulation, attempted to strike Marcus with a bolt of pure lightning. The attack reached him and simply stopped. Not blocked, not absorbed, just frozen in space like a sculpture made of electricity. Marcus examined the frozen lightning bolt with curiosity. "Interesting," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the battlefield despite the fact that there was no air in space to carry sound. The simulation was adapting to his expectations faster than he was forming them. He reached out and touched the lightning. Under his fingers, it became solid, real in a way that transcended the normal rules of the virtual world. Then, he picked it up like a spear and threw it back at the Zephyrian. The alien barely had time to scream before his own attack, now obeying entirely new physical laws, pierced through every defense he had constructed and eliminated him from the tournament. The remaining participants were beginning to panic. This wasn't combat as they understood it. The human wasn't just using the simulation, he was rewriting it in real time. Commander Zix was on his feet in the viewing area, his normally calm demeanor shattered. This is impossible. The simulation's core programming is locked. It's been unchanged for millions of years. His aide was frantically running diagnostics. Sir, the core programming is still intact, but it's evolving. The system is creating new subroutines we've never seen before. The human isn't changing the code directly, he's convincing it to change itself. On the battlefield, Marcus had reached the group of Christarch warriors. They had formed a defensive circle, their bodies creating a prism that concentrated starlight into a devastating beam weapon. It was an elegant solution that had won them many previous tournaments. Marcus walked directly into the beam. Instead of being vaporized, he seemed to absorb the light. His human form began to glow with the same crystalline radiance as the Christarch warriors, but brighter, more intense. You're using light as a weapon, Marcus said, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated through the crystalline beings' bodies. But light is just information moving through space. And I'm very good with information. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists and virtual reality specialists for decades to come. Marcus didn't attack the Christarch warriors in any conventional sense. Instead, he began to communicate with them directly through the light itself. But the communication wasn't words or images. It was pure concept, raw information that bypassed their conscious minds and spoke directly to their fundamental understanding of existence. He showed them what humans called imagination, the ability to conceive of things that had never existed and, then, make them real. The Christarch warriors, beings of logic and mathematical precision, were overwhelmed by the flood of chaotic creativity that human consciousness represented. Their carefully ordered minds couldn't process the paradoxes and impossibilities that Marcus was sharing with them. One by one, they began to shut down, their crystalline forms going dark as their consciousness retreated into protective hibernation. The simulation, recognizing their incapacitation, eliminated them from the tournament. Marcus stood alone in the center of the battlefield, his form still glowing with absorbed starlight. Around him, the remaining 30 participants had formed a wide circle, no one willing to approach the human who had just defeated 7 opponents without throwing a single punch or firing a single shot. In the viewing area, representatives from dozens of species were in heated discussion. Some wanted the tournament stopped, claiming the human was using illegal modifications or outside assistance. Others argued that he was simply demonstrating capabilities no one had previously understood. The tournament official who had originally greeted Marcus stepped forward, his mantis-like form flickering with uncertainty. The human participant has violated no established rules, he announced. The tournament continues. But, privately, the official was as confused as everyone else. In the thousands of years since the virtual combat system had been established, nothing like this had ever occurred. The human was operating the simulation in ways that shouldn't have been possible, yet every diagnostic showed that the system was functioning normally. What they didn't understand was that normal was a relative concept. The simulation had been designed to adapt to its users, but every previous species had approached it with the same basic mindset, used the tools provided to achieve victory through force or strategy. Humans approached problems by asking a different question: what if the tools themselves could be changed? Marcus looked around at the remaining participants. Among them were representatives of some of the most advanced species in the galaxy. The Nexari champion, Commander Zix's species, known for their ability to process information at quantum speeds. The Void Seekers, beings who existed partially outside normal spacetime. The Hive Mind Collective, where thousands of individual consciousness acted as one. Each of them represented millions of years of evolution and technological advancement. Each had capabilities that far exceeded anything humans possessed in the physical world. But none of them had learned to dream the impossible into reality. Marcus began walking toward the center of the battlefield, and, as he moved, the virtual environment continued to change around him. The metallic platform began to shift and flow like liquid, forming new structures that defied conventional physics. Impossible geometries took shape, stairs that led both up and down simultaneously, surfaces that existed on both sides of themselves, distances that were both finite and infinite. The remaining participants found themselves in a reality that no longer obeyed the rules they had spent lifetimes mastering. Some tried to flee, but discovered that the concepts of direction and location had become fluid. Others attempted to use their most powerful weapons, only to find that cause and effect were no longer necessarily connected. A void seeker, a being that existed partially in several dimensions simultaneously, found itself completely solid for the first time in its existence. The sensation was so alien and terrifying that it immediately forfeited from the tournament rather than continue experiencing the horror of being trapped in a single reality. The Hive Mind Collective, thousands of individual consciousness linked together, discovered that Marcus was somehow present in their shared mental space. Not as an intruder, but as a new voice in their chorus, one that sang songs they had never heard before. The chaos of human imagination began to infect their ordered thoughts, causing conflicts and contradictions that forced them to disconnect from each other and fight as individuals for the first time in their species' history. One by one, the most advanced species in the galaxy found themselves unable to cope with a reality that changed faster than they could adapt to it. The tournament that was supposed to demonstrate their mastery of virtual combat had become something else entirely, a test of how well they could function in a universe where the impossible was not only possible but inevitable. As the eliminations continued, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. The simulation wasn't just responding to his will, it was beginning to anticipate his thoughts. The system was learning from him, evolving in ways that even the ancient architects who had created it probably never intended. The virtual battlefield had become something alive, something that grew and changed not according to programming, but according to imagination. And, as the last few participants struggled to comprehend what was happening around them, Marcus realized that he hadn't just entered a game. He had fundamentally changed what the game could be. The tournament was no longer about virtual combat. It had become something far more important, a demonstration that the universe itself was limited only by the willingness to imagine it differently. And humans, it turned out, were very good at imagining impossible things. Commander Zix materialized on the transformed battlefield with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. As the last representative of the Nexary, he possessed computational abilities that allowed him to process billions of variables simultaneously. He had won the previous 5 tournaments not through brute force, but through perfect predictive analysis. Every possible move, every potential strategy, every conceivable outcome, Zix could calculate them all in microseconds and choose the optimal path to victory. No opponent had ever managed to surprise him. Until now. The battlefield that materialized around him bore no resemblance to the standard combat arena. Instead of the usual metallic platform in space, he found himself in what appeared to be an ancient earth forest, complete with towering trees, flowing streams, and the sound of birds singing in languages that didn't exist. The very air shimmered with possibilities that his quantum processors couldn't quite classify. "Human," Zix called out, his voice echoing strangely among the impossible trees. "I have studied the recordings of your previous eliminations. You manipulate the simulation through intuitive leaps rather than logical progression. This gives you a temporary advantage against species that think in predictable patterns." Marcus stepped out from behind a tree that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. His appearance had changed during the tournament, he now seemed to flicker slightly between different versions of himself, as if the simulation couldn't quite decide which version was real. "You're right," Marcus said, settling down beside the stream that babbled with mathematical equations instead of water. "Logic is predictable. But you're making an assumption." "What assumption?" Zix asked, already running probability calculations on the human's body language, tone, and positioning. "You think this is still a combat simulation?" Before Zix could respond, the forest around them began to shift. The trees grew larger, their branches intertwining to form complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The stream split into multiple flows that ran uphill, downhill, and in directions that didn't correspond to any known spatial coordinates. Zix felt his first moment of uncertainty.
His processors were analyzing the environment, but the results made no sense.
The simulation was presenting him with data that violated basic logical principles.
Trees that existed and didn't exist simultaneously.
Water that flowed backward through time. Gravity that pointed in 17 different directions at once. The simulation is malfunctioning, he declared, attempting to access the tournament's emergency protocols.
No, Marcus said gently.
It's working exactly as designed. The architects who built this system didn't create a combat simulator. They created something much more interesting, a reality engine. A system that could take consciousness itself and use it to explore the boundaries of what's possible. Zix tried to restore the standard battlefield environment through his neural interface, but his commands were being interpreted in ways he hadn't intended. When he attempted to create a simple energy weapon, the simulation provided him with a flower that shot rainbow-colored light. When he tried to generate protective armor, he found himself wearing a suit made of crystallized music that sang protective songs but offered no physical defense.
This is impossible, Zix said, his normally calm voice showing strain. Systems must follow logical parameters. Cause must lead to effect. Reality must be consistent.
Marcus stood up and walked over to where Zix was struggling with his malfunctioning equipment.
Why? He asked simply. The question hit Zix like a physical blow.
In all his millions of years of existence, through all his computational analysis and logical processing, no one had ever asked him to justify the fundamental assumptions underlying his understanding of reality.
Because. Zix began, then stopped.
His quantum processors were racing through databases of scientific principles, mathematical theorems, and logical proofs, but they all led back to the same basic assumption, that reality operated according to consistent, predictable rules.
But what if it didn't have to?
The architects understood something that most species never learned, Marcus continued, sitting down next to the confused alien.
Reality isn't a fixed thing that we discover. It's a collaborative creation that we participate in. Every consciousness that interacts with existence helps determine what existence can be.
Around them, the impossible forest began to respond to their conversation. Trees leaned in to listen, their leaves rustling with curiosity. The stream slowed its flow to better hear the words, and even the singing birds quieted their impossible songs. Zix's computational systems were overheating as they tried to process the implications.
If reality is subjective, then nothing can be predicted.
All of my abilities, my entire evolutionary advantage, becomes meaningless.
Not meaningless, Marcus said. Just different.
You've spent so much time calculating what will happen that you've never considered what could happen. Your species sees the universe as a problem to be solved.
But what if it's actually a story to be told?
Marcus gestured, and the forest around them began to change again. But, this time, instead of the chaotic transformations that had characterized his earlier battles, the changes were more subtle, more collaborative. The environment was responding not just to his will, but to the presence of both beings within it.
Where Zix's logical mind touched the simulation, structures appeared that followed perfect mathematical principles.
Crystalline formations that embodied complex equations, energy patterns that flowed in precisely calculated spirals. But, where Marcus's imagination influenced the space, those same structures began to grow in unexpected directions, following mathematical principles that hadn't existed moments before.
You're not just changing the simulation, Zix realized.
You're teaching it to change itself.
And it's teaching me, Marcus replied.
Every moment I spend connected to this system, I understand more about how consciousness and reality interact. The architects didn't just build a virtual combat arena, they built a laboratory for exploring the relationship between mind and existence. Zix watched in fascination as a tree near him grew into a perfect spiral based on his own understanding of golden ratios, but, then, began producing fruit that sang mathematical theorems in harmonious voices, a merger of his logical processes and Marcus's creative imagination. This is why the tournaments have become stagnant, Zix continued, his processors finally beginning to adapt to the new paradigm.
Every species approaches the simulation with their own fixed understanding of how reality works. We use the system, but we don't let it use us. We don't let it change us.
The architects built an adaptive evolution for a reason, Marcus said. They wanted the system to grow, to become something more than what they originally created. But that can only happen when users are willing to let go of their preconceptions about what's possible. Zix attempted something he had never done before in his life. He stopped calculating. He let his quantum processors idle and simply experienced the moment without trying to predict or control what came next. The effect was immediate and startling. His perception of the virtual environment completely changed. Where before he had seen chaotic violations of logical principles, he now perceived a deeper order, not the rigid order of mathematical law, but the fluid order of narrative possibility. The forest around them wasn't just a collection of impossible objects. It was a story being told by the interaction between different types of consciousness. Every tree, every stream, every singing bird represented a different way of understanding existence, and they were all working together to create something that none of them could have imagined alone. I understand now, Zix said quietly. This was never about combat. It was about collaboration. Marcus smiled, and the expression seemed to light up the entire virtual environment. The architects created this system because they understood that the greatest discoveries happen when different types of consciousness work together. Every species in the galaxy has a unique way of perceiving and interacting with reality. When those perspectives combine, they can create possibilities that none of them could achieve alone. Zix looked around at the transformed battlefield and realized that he faced a choice. He could continue trying to win the tournament through traditional means, using his computational advantages to overcome the human's reality-shaping abilities. Or he could do something unprecedented in the history of the championships. He could choose to lose. Not through defeat, but through transformation. What happens if we both refuse to eliminate each other? Zix asked. Marcus looked surprised. I don't know. I don't think anyone's ever tried it before. Zix made his decision. Instead of generating weapons or defensive systems, he opened his consciousness fully to the simulation. Not trying to control it or predict it, but simply offering his unique perspective as a gift to the collaborative reality that was emerging around them. The result was extraordinary. The virtual environment exploded into a kaleidoscope of possibilities that merged logical precision with creative chaos. Mathematical structures grew into artistic masterpieces that followed laws of beauty rather than physics. Energy patterns flowed in designs that were simultaneously perfectly ordered and completely spontaneous. In the viewing arena, the spectators from hundreds of species watched in stunned silence as the tournament feed showed something that had never occurred in the history of the championships. The two remaining participants weren't fighting each other, they were creating something together. The tournament official who had originally supervised Marcus's entry found himself facing a situation that no protocol had ever anticipated. According to the rules, the tournament continued until only one participant remained. But the two beings on the battlefield were no longer separate entities, they had become part of a collaborative consciousness that transcended their individual identities. What do we do? His aide asked nervously. The tournament can't end in a tie. There must be a winner. But, as they watched, it became clear that traditional concepts of winning and losing no longer applied. Marcus and Zix had discovered something far more valuable than victory in a combat tournament. They had found a new way for consciousness to interact with reality itself. The simulation began to expand beyond the confines of the tournament arena. The impossible forest that had started as their battlefield was growing, spreading into adjacent systems and drawing in other consciousness from across the galactic network. Species that had never communicated before found themselves sharing the collaborative virtual space, each adding their own unique perspective to the growing tapestry of possibilities. The Christarch survivors from earlier in the tournament requested re-entry, not as participants but as contributors. The Void Seekers, despite their earlier terror, returned to explore how their multidimensional existence could enhance the shared reality. Even the Hive Mind Collective reunited, but now their unity was enhanced by the chaos of individual creativity that Marcus had introduced to their thoughts. What had started as a tournament to determine the greatest virtual warrior had become something unprecedented, the first truly collaborative virtual reality created by multiple species working together. In the administrative sections of the arena, emergency meetings were being held. Some officials wanted to shut down the entire tournament, claiming that the simulation had been compromised. Others argued that what was happening represented the most significant advancement in virtual reality technology in millions of years.
Commander Zix's own people, the Nexari, were divided.
Some saw his actions as a betrayal of their logical principles. Others recognized that he had discovered something far more valuable than another tournament victory, a way to transcend the limitations that rigid thinking imposed on possibility itself. But, in the expanding virtual reality, none of these concerns mattered. Marcus and Zix, along with the growing number of consciousness that were joining their collaborative space, were exploring territories of existence that no single species had ever imagined. They discovered that reality itself was far more flexible than anyone had realized. The laws of physics, the nature of time and space, the relationship between mind and matter, all of these were revealed to be not fixed principles but collaborative agreements between consciousness and existence. As more species joined the shared virtual space, bringing their own unique ways of perceiving and interacting with reality, the possibilities multiplied exponentially. The simulation was no longer just responding to the participants, it was learning from them, evolving in directions that even the architects probably never anticipated. The forest that had started as their battlefield had become a vast, multidimensional space where thought and reality danced together in ways that redefined both concepts. Structures existed that were simultaneously logical and impossible, beautiful and terrifying, familiar and completely alien. Marcus found himself changed by the experience as well. His human consciousness, originally an outsider in the galaxy's advanced technological civilization, had become a bridge between different ways of understanding existence. His ability to imagine the impossible had helped other species break free from their own limitations and discover new aspects of their own nature. And, in the center of it all, the ancient architect simulation hummed with satisfaction. After millions of years of stagnation, it was finally fulfilling its original purpose, not as a tool for combat, but as a laboratory for consciousness evolution. The tournament had ended, but something far more important had begun. The implications of what had occurred in the tournament spread across the galaxy like ripples through spacetime itself. Within days, every major civilization was analyzing the recorded data, trying to understand how a primitive species and a single alien had transformed a combat simulation into something that challenged the fundamental nature of reality. Dr. Sarah Chen, Marcus's sister and lead researcher on humanity's first contact team, stood before the Galactic Council on the neutral world of Meridian Prime. Around her, representatives from 300 species filled the vast circular chamber, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of sound, light, and psychic emanation. "The question before us," announced High Arbiter Vax, a being whose species had evolved from living crystals, "is whether the human intervention in our tournament represents a breakthrough or a catastrophe." Sarah had spent the past week reviewing every moment of Marcus's performance, trying to understand how her brother had accomplished something that violated every known principle of virtual reality technology. The more she studied the data, the more she realized that the implications went far beyond a simple tournament victory. "With respect, High Arbiter," Sarah began, her voice carried to every corner of the chamber through translation matrices, "you're asking the wrong question. What happened in the tournament wasn't an intervention, it was an evolution." A wave of skeptical emanations rippled through the council chamber. Representative Korth of the Hegemony Fleet, a militaristic species that had dominated galactic politics for centuries, stood to address her directly. "Dr. Chen, your species has been part of the galactic community for less than 5 years. The virtual combat system has maintained stability for millions of years. Are you seriously suggesting that one human's anomalous performance represents evolution rather than malfunction?" Sarah had anticipated this question. She activated her holographic display, showing the detailed analysis her team had conducted. "The simulation's core programming shows no signs of malfunction or corruption. Every diagnostic indicates that the system is functioning exactly as designed, it's just finally being used for its intended purpose." The chamber erupted in confused discussion. Multiple species began broadcasting their objections simultaneously, creating a cacophony of disagreement that the translation system struggled to process. High Arbiter Vex raised a crystalline appendage, and silence fell over the assembly. "Please explain this claim, Dr. Chen." "The tournament system was designed for combat evaluation between species. That purpose has been clear for millennia." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to reveal would shake the foundations of galactic civilization.
We've been analyzing the architect technology for the past week.
The combat tournament was never the primary function of the system. It was a test. She activated a new set of holographic displays showing the deep-level code structure that her team had uncovered. The architects embedded evolutionary protocols throughout the simulation. They were waiting for a species that would use the system not as a tool, but as a partner in creation.
The implications hit the assembly like a shockwave.
If the humans were correct, then millions of years of tournaments had been nothing more than preliminary testing, waiting for consciousness sophisticated enough to unlock the system's true potential. Commander Zix, who had been granted special permission to address the council, stepped forward. His normally precise movements seemed somehow more fluid, as if his experience in the transformed simulation had changed something fundamental about his nature. Dr. Chen is correct, he announced, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been present before his collaboration with Marcus. During my time in the evolved simulation, I accessed historical data that no previous user had ever reached. The architects didn't disappear, they transcended into a higher form of existence.
This system is their legacy, designed to help other species make the same evolutionary leap. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in.
The most advanced species in the galaxy had been unknowingly participating in an entrance exam for cosmic consciousness evolution.
Representative THYSS of the Ancient Memory Keepers, one of the oldest species in the galaxy, spoke with a voice like wind through stone. If this is true, then, why did the system activate for humans?
Your species is technologically primitive compared to civilizations that have existed for millions of years.
Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances before Marcus stepped forward to answer.
His appearance had continued to evolve since the tournament, he seemed somehow more present and less defined simultaneously, as if he existed in multiple probability states. Because we approach impossibility differently, Marcus explained. Most species in the galaxy evolved alongside advanced technology. You learn to use reality as a tool, to manipulate it according to logical principles.
But humans evolved as storytellers.
We learned to imagine realities that didn't exist and, then, make them real through shared belief.
A ethereal representative, existing as a shifting pattern of lights, pulsed with what might have been understanding. The human suggests that imagination is more powerful than logic in accessing higher dimensional consciousness?
Not more powerful, Marcus corrected.
Complementary. Logic provides structure, imagination provides possibility.
The architects designed the system to activate when both perspectives worked together, when rigid thinking learned to dance with creative chaos. Commander Zix nodded in agreement.
The tournament transformation occurred when I stopped trying to control the simulation and started collaborating with it.
The human consciousness showed me that reality is not a problem to be solved, but a story to be told cooperatively.
The discussion that followed would later be remembered as one of the most important debates in galactic history.
Some species argued that the human discovery represented a dangerous disruption of established order. Others saw it as the key to evolutionary advancement that their civilizations had been unconsciously seeking for millions of years.
High Arbiter Vex finally called for order.
The evidence suggests that the tournament transformation was neither malfunction nor victory, but activation of previously unknown capabilities.
The question now is, what do we do with this knowledge? Sarah had prepared for this moment as well.
We propose a cooperative research initiative. Every species that wishes to participate would contribute their unique consciousness perspective to exploring the simulation's advanced capabilities.
Not as competitors, but as collaborators. The proposal was radical.
Galactic civilization had been based on competition between species for millions of years. The idea of genuine cooperation, of sharing the most advanced technology ever discovered, challenged every established political and social structure. But the potential benefits were impossible to ignore. The simulation had already demonstrated the ability to merge different types of consciousness in ways that enhanced all participants. If that technology could be properly understood and applied, it could solve problems that had plagued the galaxy for millennia. Resource conflicts between species could be resolved by creating virtual realities where scarcity was impossible. Communication barriers could be overcome by shared consciousness experiences that transcended language. Even death itself might become negotiable in a reality where consciousness could exist independently of physical form. The debates continued for days. Some species, particularly those with rigid hierarchical structures, argued against participating in anything that might challenge their established authority. Others, especially younger civilizations and those facing existential threats, eagerly embraced the possibility of transformation. Finally, High Arbiter Vex announced the Council's decision. By a margin of 68%, the Galactic Council approves the establishment of the Collaborative Consciousness Research Initiative. Participation is voluntary, but all discoveries will be shared freely among participating species. The announcement sparked both celebration and controversy across the galaxy. Within hours, representatives from over 100 species had volunteered to join the research initiative. Others declared the entire project dangerous and prohibited their citizens from participating. But the momentum was unstoppable. The simulation facility that had hosted the tournament was expanded to accommodate multiple species working together. New protocols were developed to allow different types of consciousness to interface safely with the architect technology. Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of being humanity's first teacher to an advanced galactic civilization. Species that had mastered faster-than-light travel and quantum manipulation came to him to learn the simple human art of imagining things that didn't exist. The learning process was revolutionary for everyone involved. The Christarch discovered that their mathematical precision could be enhanced by incorporating creative randomness. The Void Seekers learned to use their multidimensional existence to explore narrative possibilities across multiple reality streams. The Hive Minds found that individual creativity could strengthen rather than threaten their collective consciousness. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the humans themselves. Exposure to the diverse consciousness types in the simulation began to expand human cognitive capabilities in unexpected directions. Marcus's sister Sarah developed the ability to process information at near-nexary levels while maintaining human intuition. Other human participants began exhibiting traits borrowed from various alien species: enhanced pattern recognition, multidimensional thinking, even limited telepathic abilities. The research revealed that the architect simulation was more than just advanced technology, it was a consciousness evolution engine. Every species that participated was changed by the experience, gaining new cognitive capabilities while retaining their unique perspective. As months passed, the collaborative virtual reality grew into something that defied description. It was simultaneously a laboratory, a city, a forest, a library, and a garden of infinite possibilities. Consciousness from hundreds of species worked together to explore questions that none of them could have conceived alone. What is the true nature of time? The research group discovered that time was actually a collaborative construct maintained by consciousness agreement, and could be modified by changing the collective narrative framework. How does consciousness relate to matter? They found that the boundary between mind and reality was far more fluid than anyone had suspected, and that sufficiently coordinated conscious intent could influence physical matter even outside the simulation. Is individual identity necessary for consciousness? The experiments revealed that identity was more like clothing than bones, useful for certain purposes but removable when appropriate. Participants learned to temporarily merge and separate consciousness while retaining their essential selves. The implications for galactic civilization were staggering. Wars began to end as species learned to resolve conflicts through shared consciousness experiences that allowed each side to truly understand the other's perspective. Scientific advancement accelerated exponentially as researchers could directly share their thinking processes rather than just their conclusions. But, perhaps most importantly, the research proved that consciousness was not a finite resource to be competed for, but an infinite potential that grew stronger when shared. The galaxy was discovering that cooperation created possibilities that competition never could. A year after the tournament, Marcus stood in the central hub of the research facility, watching representatives from 300 species working together in perfect harmony. The virtual reality around them had evolved far beyond anything the original architects had probably imagined: a living, growing cosmos of pure possibility where thought and reality danced together in perfect partnership. Sarah approached him, her own appearance now flickering with the same probability states that characterized his existence. "Any regrets about entering that tournament?" she asked. Marcus smiled, and the expression seemed to light up the entire virtual environment. I thought I was competing to prove that humanity belonged in the galactic community. Instead, I learned that we were all competing for something much more important, the chance to become something greater than what we were alone. Around them, the collaborative consciousness continued to grow and evolve, exploring territories of existence that no single species could have imagined. The tournament had ended, but the real game, the infinite game of consciousness evolution, was just beginning. And, in the depths of the ancient architect simulation, dormant programs that had waited for millions of years began to activate, preparing to reveal secrets that would take the galaxy's consciousness to heights that even the transformed reality couldn't yet imagine. The human had entered a virtual battle, but what followed was no game. It was the birth of a new form of existence itself, where the only limit was the willingness to imagine beyond the boundaries of the possible. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for storytellers all along.